to be together on this day. How good it is, how sweet it is to be together on this day. Hine ma tov u'manayim sheberachim gam yachad. 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 Sheberachim gam yachad.
All right, Shabbat Shalom. Hi, Barbara. Shabbat Shalom.
Good morning.
Good
Shabbat.
morning to you. And hello to everybody out there in cyberspace. We're so glad that you're joining us for this Shabbat morning. I'm actually joining you from my office at the temple, which feels really good. It feels good to be back in this building and getting back into our sacred space on this restful and sacred day. So this morning, as we do each week, we'll be praying the prayers from Mishkan Tefillah, our prayer book, and we'll try to do our best to remember to share the pages with you as you go. For now, we're going to start on page 74 of those books, where you will find the words of Ma Tovu. I encourage you to sing along at home or wherever you are so that we can create a sacred space together.
Ma tovu, ma tovu, ohalecha Yaakov, mishkenotecha Yisrael, ma tovu, ma tovu. ohalecha Yaakov, mishkenotecha Yisrael, va'ani beruchasecha, avo beitecha, eshtachave elecha al kodshecha, ve'yiratecha. Ma tovu, ma tovu, ohalecha Yaakov, mishkenotecha Yisrael, Adonai ahavti me'od beitecha, u'mikol mishkan kevodecha, mishkan kodecha, va'ani eshtachaveh ve'echra'ah evrecha lifnei Adonai, osi ma tovu, ma tovu, ohalecha Yaakov, mishkenotecha Yisrael, ma tovu, ma tovu, ohalecha Yaakov, mishkenotecha Yisrael, va'ani tefilati lecha, Adonai et ratzon, Elohim berov chastecha, Elohim berov chastecha.
We'll continue on page 77, this blessing, giving thanks to God for our bodies. Blessed are you, Adonai, our God, sovereign of the universe. With divine wisdom you have made our bodies, combining veins, arteries, and vital organs into a finely balanced network. Wondrous maker and sustainer of life, were one of them to fail, how well we are aware we would lack the strength to stand before you. Blessed are you, Adonai, source of our health and strength. Baruch ata Adonai, rofechol basar umafli la'asot.
Elohai neshama shenatata b'tevorani. Elohai neshama shenatata b'tevorani. Elohai neshama shenatata bi. Elohai neshama tevorani. Elohai neshama shenatata bi tevorani. Elohai neshama shenatata b'tevorani.
Beautiful. So this service starts with the blessings for our bodies and for our souls, and then we continue now, starting on page 80, with sort of a full body inventory of all the other things that we have to be grateful for this morning: the ability to move and stretch, clothes to cover our bodies, a place to live, solid ground under our feet. So we'll continue on page 80. If you have a prayer book in front of you, these blessings are on the even numbered pages, starting on page 80. Barbara, how about you and I take turns alternating blessings one at a time?
Wonderful. Go ahead.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, who has given the mind the ability to distinguish day from night.
Amen. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, who opens the eyes of the blind.
Amen. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, who frees the captive.
Amen. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, who lifts up the fallen.
Amen. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, who stretches the earth over the waters.
Amen. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, who strengthens our steps.
Amen. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, who clothes the naked.
Amen. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, who gives strength to the weary.
Amen. I really need this one today. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, who removes sleep from the eyes, slumber from the eyelids.
Amen. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, who made me in the image of God.
Amen. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, who has made me free.
Amen. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, who has made me a Jew.
Amen. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, who girds Israel with strength.
Amen. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, who crowns Israel with splendor.
Amen. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah.
Amen.
Continuing now with just a little crumb of Torah for this morning from the Mishnah at the bottom of page 88. This listing of the obligations we have to one another that come from being part of a community of purpose. These are things that are limitless, of which a person enjoys the fruit of the world while the principle remains in the world to come. They are honoring one's father and mother, engaging in deeds of compassion, arriving early for study, morning and evening, dealing graciously with guests, visiting the sick, providing for the wedding couple, accompanying the dead for burial, being devoted in prayer, and making peace among people, but the study of Torah encompasses them all. Continue now with Psalm 150 on page 100 of our books.
Hallelujah, 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 because hallelujah, Vicky Abuso, hallelujah, Vikurata, hallelujah, Hero, hallelujah, 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 hallelujah. Hallelujah, hallelujah, hallelujah. Take out Shabbat, hallelujah. The never before, hallelujah. The tofu mafor, hallelujah. The meaning of God, hallelujah. Hallelujah, hallelujah, hallelujah. Hallelujah, hallelujah, hallelujah. B'tzil tzilei shama, hallelujah. B'tzil tzilei Torah, hallelujah. B'tzil tzilei shama, hallelujah. B'tzil tzilei Torah, olam shama. Hallelujah, hallelujah, hallelujah. Hallelujah, hallelujah, hallelujah.
Chatzi Kaddish is on page 106.
Yitkadal v'yitkadash shmei Rabbah ve'almad yivrach yirtei yamlich malchutei b'chayechon u'vyomechon u'chayei l'chol beit Yisrael bagala bagala u'bizman kariv ve'meru Amen. Yehi shmei Rabbah mevorach le'olam lo me'almayah yiparach yiparach ve'yishtabach ve'yipa'ar v'yitramam v'yitnasei ve'yithadar v'yithaleh v'yithalal shemei d'kudisha richu La'elah min kol berchata v'shirata Tushbechata v'nechemata Damiran me'alma Ve'meru Amen. We rise for the Baruch Hu. Baruch Hu et Adonai HaMevorach. Baruch Hu et Adonai HaMevorach. Baruch Adonai HaMevorach.
Ata Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, Yotzer or uvorei choshech, Osei shalom uvorei et hakol. Hameir la'aretz v'ladarim aleha barachamim, Uvtuvo mechadesh b'chol yom tamid ma'aseh v'reishit. Ma rabu ma'asecha Adonai, Kulam b'chochma asita, Malach ha'aretz kinyanecha. Titbarach Adonai Eloheinu al shevach ma'aseh yadecha, Ve'al me'orei or she'asita yifa'arucha selah. Or chadash al Tzion ta'ir, V'nizkechu lanu mehera le'oro, Baruch ata Adonai, Yotzer ha'me'orot. When justice burns within us like a flaming fire, when love evokes willing sacrifice from us, when to the last full measure of selfless devotion we demonstrate our belief in the ultimate triumph of truth and righteousness, then your goodness enters our lives, and we can begin to change the world. And then you live in our hearts, and we through righteousness behold your presence. Baruch ata Adonai, habocher be'amo Yisrael be'ahava.
Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Baruch Shem Kevod Malchuto Leolam Vaed. ואהבת את אדוני אלוהיך בכל לבבך ובכל נפשך ובכל מאודיך, והיו הדברים האלה אשר אנוכי מצווך היום על לבבך, ושיננתם לבניך ודיברת בם בשבתך בביתך ובלכתך בדרך ובשוכבך ובקומך, וקשרתם לאות על ידיך, והיו לטוטפות בין עיניך, וכתבתם על מזוזות ביתך ובשעריך, למען תזכרו ועשיתם את כל מצוותיי, והייתם קדושים לאלוהיכם. אני אדוני אלוהיכם, אשר הוצאתי אתכם מארץ מצרים, להיות לכם לאלוהים. אני אדוני אלוהיכם.
Before Michamocha, this poem by Hugh Nissenson, which is on page 123 of our prayer books. The good in us will win. Over all the wickedness, over all the wrongs we have done, we will look back at the pages of written history and be amazed, and then we will laugh and sing. And the good that is in us, children in their cradles, will have won. Our hearts beat with certainty that there is a day and an hour and a mountain called Zion, and that all the sufferings will gather there and become song, ringing out into every corner of the earth from end to end, and the nations will hear it, and like the caravans in the desert, will all to that morning throng.
מי כמוך באלים אדוני, מי כמוך נהדר בקודש, נורא תהילות עוסק בלב, נורא תהילות עוסק בלב, שירה חדשה שברכו גאולים לשמך על שפת הים, יחד כולם הודו והמליכו ואמרו אדוני Adonai yimloch le'olam va'ed. Tzur Yisrael, kuma be'ezrat Yisrael, ufedechenu mecha, Yehuda ve'Yisrael. Go aleinu, Adonai tzvaot shemo, Kedosh Yisrael, Baruch atah Adonai, Gal Yisrael. Adonai sefatai tifnach, ufi agid tehilatecha. Adonai, open up my lips, that my mouth may declare your praise. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu v'Elohei Avotenu v'Imotenu, Elohei Abraham, Elohei Yitzchak, Elohei Yaakov, Elohei Sarah, Elohei Rivka, Elohei Rachel, Elohei Leah, Ha'el Hagadol, Hagibor v'Hanora, El Elyon, Gomer Chasadim Tovim, V'Konei Hakol, V'Zocher Chasdei Avot V'Imachot, U'Mevi Geula Livnei B'neihem, L'ma'an Shemo B'Ahava, Melech Ozer U'Moshiach U'Magen, Baruch atah Adonai, Magen Avraham, Bezrat Sarah. Atah Gibor Le'olam Adonai, Mechayeh HaKol atah Rav leHoshia, Morid Hatal, Mechalkel Chaim Bechesed, Mechayeh HaKol Berachamim Rabim, Somech Noflim Verofei Cholim, Umatir Asurim, Umekayem Emunato, Lishenei Afar, Michamocha Bal Gevurot, Umidom Belach, Melech Memit Umechayeh, Umatzmiach Yeshua, V'ne'emanata lehachayot hakol, Baruch atah Adonai, Mechayeh hakol. Nekadesh et shimcha ba'olam, Shem shemakdishim oto b'shnei marom, Kakatul al yad neviecha, V'kara ze el ze ve'amar, Kadosh, 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 Adonai Tzevaot, Elohol haaretz, Kevodo, Adir, Adirenu, Adonai, Adonenu ma'atir, Shimcha bechol haaretz, Baruch Kevod Adonai Minkomo. Echadu Eloheinu, Hu Avinu, Hu Malkeinu, Hu Moshienu, Ve'hu Yashmienu, Ve'rachamav le'enei kol chai. Ani Adonai Elohechem, Yimloch Adonai le'olam, Elohai Tzion. נצח נצחים קדושת הנקדיש ושפחך אלוהינו מפינו לא ימוש לעולם ועד. ברוך אתה אדוני האל הקדוש.
We'll take a bit of time now for our own quiet individual prayer.
עושה שלום במרומה, הוא יעשה שלום עלינו ועל כל ישראל ועל כל יושבי תבל ואמרו
We'll continue hearing some words from this week's Parsha for this Torah section of our service. This morning we are in Parashat Shemini, which is reading from the 10th chapter of the book of Leviticus. So I'm going to ask Barbara to give me a little Torah music while I get the verses up and ready for everybody else. So Barbara, if you'll just unmute and give us a little Torah music, I will get our verses ready.
רוממו אדוני אלוהינו והשתחוו לפני קודשו. רוממו אדוני אלוהינו והשתחוו לפני קודשו. כי קדוש אדוני אלוהינו רוממו. כי קדוש אדוני אלוהינו רוממו.
This morning, as I said, we're in Parashat Shemini. This is a section of the Torah that contains a bunch of miscellaneous instructions to the priests for their successful execution of the wilderness sacrifices. This morning, we're going to be reading from the beginning of the 10th chapter, which is a troubling and brief episode in the life of Aaron, Moses' brother, which we're going to have a little chance to study a bit more closely after the break. But for now, these words from Leviticus 10, verses 1 through 3. Vaychu v'nei Aharon Nadav v'Avihu, ish machtato, vayitnu vahen esh v'yasimu aleha ketoret, v'yakruvu lifnei Adonai esh zara asher lo tziva otam. ותצא אש מלפני אדוני ותאכל אותם וימותו לפני אדוני. ויאמר משה אל אהרון, הוא אשר דיבר אדוני לאמור, Bikrovai ekadesh al pnei chol ha'am ekabed, vayidom Aharon. We will come back to those words of Leviticus shortly thereafter and talk a little bit about Aaron's response to tragedy. But before we do, we're going to take a second to turn our thoughts a little bit closer to our own community and in some cases our own families. So offer some words of Mishaberach. The Mishaberach is on page 253 of your books. You can get there with your hands and your eyes, but I do want to make sure that we turn with our hearts and with our thoughts to the people who are in need of healing these days. This is a prayer with even more relevance and importance. So let's take a second to think about the people we know and love and those that we don't, and offer on their behalf this prayer of healing. And Barbara will unmute herself so we can sing along with her.
May the source of strength who bless the ones before us, help us find the courage to make our lives a blessing, and let us say Amen. Bless those in need of healing with refuah shlema, the renewal of body, the renewal of spirit, and let us say Amen. And let us say
I want to share a few announcements with you before we do a little learning of our Parsha together. Please make sure that your calendars are marked for this coming Tuesday, April the 13th at 7 p.m. This is going to be Cantor Simmons' amazing online concert experience, featuring not just our beloved Cantor, but also a talented group of musicians who will be joining her. So it's Tuesday the 13th at 7 o'clock. The concert will be all online, and you can connect and watch that concert the same way that you're watching this service this morning. Please do make a point to join us. It's going to be fabulous. I've had a chance to get a little sneak peek at the program, and it's going to be wonderful. Just some really, really wonderful musicians. And the sort of title of the concert is The Man Upstairs, Questioning God Through Music. So it's a combination of some provocative words and music and ideas. I promise you it's going to be a really meaningful, wonderful experience. So please join us Tuesday night for the Cantors concert. I also want to let you know about something else starting this week, and that is our new Emanu running club. So if you've taken up running during the pandemic, or if you'd like to take up doing a little bit of light running, we're going to be meeting Wednesday mornings at 7:45. We'll be meeting at the West Lot here at Temple, and then making our way around the Rice Outer Loop. Doesn't matter how fast you go, how far you want to go. Beginners or experts are welcome. Please join us Wednesday mornings, 7:45. Should be a good time, and we'll be great to see you. Another note for your calendar, our congregational annual meeting, Sunday, April 18th at 4 p.m. on Zoom. If you are a member of our congregation, it will be really important that you join us for this meeting at 4 o'clock. We need you. We need a quorum to make sure that we can get our way into the next fiscal year. And we also really relish this opportunity to share the State of the Union with all of our members, both from a staff and clergy perspective and also from our lay leadership. and the executives of our board. So please make a point of joining us Sunday the 18th at 4 p.m. on Zoom. Lastly, as you know, our congregation has moved into phase 4 of our reopening plan, which is broadening the number of worshipers that can join us in the pew and to keep building on the momentum of our in-person programmatic offerings at the temple. So if you'd like to join us for Shabbat worship in person in the Bearer Sanctuary Friday nights, we will continue to ask you to register online, please. Of course, if you're not quite ready to join us in person, we are going to continue offering everything that we do electronically and through live streaming. So I'm looking forward to seeing you either in person or online as we make our way forward together. All right, so let's do a little bit of learning as promised. I'm going to pop these verses of Torah back up on your screen so you can take a look at them, and we can start exploring a little bit about how these verses have made their way into modern thought and into this week's calendar in particular. So as we saw, the verses of Parshat Shmini that we read this morning talks about the untimely death of Aaron's sons. Without a whole lot of explanation, the Torah tells us this, that Aaron's sons Nadav and Avihu each took his fire pan, put fire in it and laid incense on it, and they offered alien fire before Adonai, which God had not commanded them. The fire came forth from Adonai and consumed them, thus they died in the presence of God. Then Moses said to Aaron, "This is what Adonai meant when God said, 'Through those near to me I will be sanctified and be glorified before the people.'" And Aaron was silent. The Torah doesn't tell us a whole lot more about why Nadav and Avihu died. Certainly there have been all kinds of rabbinic interpretations that suggest that they died as a punishment as a result of something that they did. A lot of these commentators point to the verse there at the beginning, at the end of verse 1, where it describes their offering as having been Esh Zara, alien fire that was not commanded by God. So there's all sorts of creative interpretations that suggest that Nadav and Avihu died because they did something wrong. The Torah doesn't give us a whole lot of detail, and we certainly don't get a lot of detail about what was going on inside Aaron when his sons died. All we get is this very brief two-word coda at the end of verse 3, Vayidom Aharon, and Aaron was silent. So Aaron's silence has also been interpreted in a whole lot of different ways. It's not clear whether he was silent with rage or with sadness, resentment, or maybe he was just as confused and uncomprehending as we are as readers, not understanding what it was that led to his sons' deaths. Now that moment of silence, that blank, that gap in the dialogue of the Torah is also expanded on by the commentators, and generations of rabbis and thinkers and commentators try to make sense of Aaron's silence in the face of tragedy. We're going to look at a couple of pieces of explanations about what Aaron's silence may have meant. The first thing that we're going to look at is a section that comes from the Talmud, from the rabbinic writings in a tractate called Megillah. And this is what the rabbis say about silence. Rabbi Elazar said, "What's the meaning of that which is written? Mi yimalel gvurot Yisrael." You may know those words from a song that we sing on Hanukkah. Who can utter the mighty acts of the Lord? Who can declare God's praise? That comes from the Psalms. And what Rabbi Elazar says this means is that it's sort of a rhetorical question he asks. For whom is it fitting to utter the mighty acts of God? Only one who can declare all of God's praise. In other words, it's not appropriate for anyone to go on and talk about how great God is unless you're able to say everything that God does and is that is great and spectacular. And since no one is capable of declaring all of God's praises, Rabbi Elazar said, we shouldn't even try. So because no human, no mortal is capable of talking about all of the great things God does and is capable of, let's just stick with the formulas of the prayers, or alternatively, silence. And this is where Rabbi Yehuda chimes in. Rabbi Yehuda, trying to answer the psalmist's same question, the psalmist who asked, who can retell, who can utter the mighty acts of God? Rabbi Yehuda says, nobody. Rabbi Yehuda from the village of Giboria taught, what's the meaning of that which was written elsewhere in the Psalms? For you, silence is praise. It means that the best thing that we can do in praise of God is just to be quiet. Best remedy of all is silence. In other words, the optimum form of praising God is silence. Because God's presence and God's deeds are so enormous and indescribable, maybe the best tribute that we can do is to just take a minute and be quiet, not try to fill the space with our own words and our own interpretations, but just to sort of sit in silent reflection of God's presence in the world. That, I think, is one reason that we always try to be careful to give ourselves a room for silence and experiences at times of prayer, because we know that the words of the prayer book, the words of the songs are great and expressive and cathartic, but sometimes we just need a little bit of empty space and silence to do our own individual work of prayer. When Rav Dimi came from the land of Israel to Babylonia, he said, in the West, in other words, in Israel, they say this adage, if a word is worth one coin, silence is worth two. It's a great saying, isn't it? That we all know a lot of people who often try to fill every silence with speech. And sometimes it's a good reminder that silence can be just as powerful and valuable as words. So reading the Leviticus text through this lens of the Talmud, maybe one conclusion is that Aaron was overwhelmed with a sense of God's power, that Aaron knew that he shouldn't or couldn't say anything to try to explain or interpret what had happened, but instead just to keep silence and appreciate the power of God's presence in the world. Now, that is satisfying on one level as a sort of theological expression of how human beings ought to respond to God's powerful presence in the world. It is not, I would suggest, as satisfying as an explanation when it comes to understanding the way that we receive tragedy in the world. The story of Nadav and Avihu is certainly a tragic story. Two young men died before their time for no reason really that we can discern from the text. It is in some very real ways a senseless death. And so to receive that senselessness with silence is only of limited, is only sort of limited in its satisfaction. This week, the reason that I bring this up, silence as a response to tragedy, is that this week our Jewish world observed Yom HaShoah. We observed the International Holocaust Remembrance Day as a Jewish day of mourning and grief and memory. The story of Aaron's silence and of the death of the young priests is often used as a touchstone text at this time of the year, because in the same way that our treatment of and interpretation of the Holocaust does, the reading of this text brings us to do some real soul-searching exploration of what it means when those who are innocent die, when there is death and destruction that seems meaningless and senseless and just overwhelmingly tragic. How do we meet that tragedy? How do we confront and respond to loss that seems senseless? And maybe this gives us a new dimension to understanding why Aaron was silent. I want to share with you a poem that also talks a little bit about silence when it comes to a tragedy on the scale of the Holocaust. And this is a poem that comes from Elie Wiesel, who of course was the sort of preeminent memoirist, poet, also theologian really, about the tragedy of the Holocaust and its meaning to modern Judaism and to modern history. He writes as follows: silence. Where in this Holocaust is the word of God? The world was silent. The world was still. And now survivors stammer. Their words are haunted. Behind the silence, a witness to the sin of silence. And in the camps and streets of Europe, mother and father and child lay dying, and many looked away. To look away from evil, is not this the sin of all good people? So for Wiesel, silence now takes several different shapes. The beginning of the poem, he talks about God's silence, that in the aftermath of the death and destruction, the Jewish impulse is to turn to try to hear what God has to say. And after the Holocaust, we couldn't hear God saying anything. And in God's silence after the Holocaust, there seems to be a great and chilling new sort of meaning about loss and tragedy. But he goes on through the course of the poem to talk about other different sorts of silence and wordlessness. He talks about the stammering attempt of survivors to tell their stories, a witness to the sin of silence. Now, those survivors were the witness, but it's not their silence that was the sin. The sin only becomes clear in the last few lines of the poem. The sin comes from those who looked away from evil. The ends to look away from evil, is not this the sin of all good people? So there's the silence of grief, there is the silence of the survivors, and there is, in the end, maybe the greatest tragedy, the sin of complicity, the sin of looking away, of not speaking up when a word might have changed something, for not speaking up in defense of the defenseless. So now Aaron's silence from the Bible seems to take on a whole new set of field of meanings, that after death and tragedy, silence can be mournful, but also silence can be sinful. So the last thing that I want to share with you, sort of an acknowledgement of this week's difficult memorial of Yom HaShoah, is a different kind of silence that to me is maybe the most powerful of them all. And the silence that I want to talk about last is the one that shows up in a very particular visual gap on this graph. This is a chart that the Washington Post published a couple of years ago, tracking the Jewish population of the world. You can see on the left half of the graph, the Jewish population rising to, as you can see, 1 point, hang on, am I getting this right? Yeah, 16.6 million. And for obvious reasons, once we hit 1939, 1942, 1945, the numbers plummet farther and farther downward. Now, these are statistics that were gathered up until 2014. We know that up until about 2020 or so, the numbers continue to rise, thank God. But the silence that I want to talk about is the silence that is found in this gap on the graph, that the Jewish population of the world has still not yet reached the point at which it was before the war. We have not yet returned to 16.6 million Jews in the world. So that emptiness, that gap, that silence from what should have been a joyful, exuberant, vocal Jewish population in the world is silent and is still. And that silence is never going to be refilled. Those losses, those absences, those deaths, those vanishings that were brought about in the Holocaust remain empty and vacant and accusatory, I think. Their silence reflecting the kinds of silences that Wiesel talks about, the silence of complicity, the silence of those who could have said something and did not. And no matter what we do now to fill in the stories of those survivors, to share their testimonies, to grieve their losses, nothing that we can do is going to refill or replace the gaps of those silences. So this week of Yom HaShoah is certainly a time of tribute and memory, recollection, and grief, to pay honor to those who were martyred in the Holocaust. But it is also, I think, a light that shines on our Torah verses in a new way, reminding us that sometimes in the face of tragedy, we are just left with silence. Aaron's response now seems to make a different kind of sense to us, because when loss is senseless, when loss is as tragic and as extensive as we've seen in our lifetimes, sometimes all that one can do is to remember and to stay silent. So I want to wish you fruitful memories. I want to thank you for the work that you've done to help keep those memories alive, and the work that our whole Jewish community has done to pay tribute to those who are gone, and to remember that their silence is not meaningless. So, on that note, speaking of memory, speaking of tribute, and of the impulse to fill an unfathomable silence with words of tribute and words of prayer, we've come now to the time of our Kaddish in this service, like we do each time we pray together. And we start as we do each time we pray the Kaddish as a reminder that our thoughts are turning to those who have departed the earth, our own loved ones, are those whom our friends and neighbors have lost, the martyrs of our people whose graves are unmarked, and those of every race and nation whose lives have been a blessing to humanity. As we remember them, we meditate on the meaning of love and loss, of life and death. We're going to take just a moment now silently to do our own work of memory. And so we think now of our loved ones whom death has recently taken from us, those who died at this season in years past, and those whom we've drawn into our hearts with our own. In addition to this week's memories associated with Yom HaShoah, we take just a moment this week to remember those members of our community who have died and been laid to rest recently. We remember Jeffrey Mark and Sybil Belasco, and know that our prayers go out to their families. And so, as we do, united together in our silence and in our words of prayer, we turn to page 294 and we rise together for the recitation of Kaddish. Yitkadal v'yitkadash shemei Rabbah, ve'alma divrach cherutei v'yamlich malchutei, v'chayechon v'yomechon v'chaye d'chol beit Yisrael, v'agala u'vizman kari v'imru amen. Yehe shmei Rabbah mevarach le'olam l'olmei almaya, Yitbarach, Yishtabach, Yitba'ar, Yitramam, Yitnaseh, Yitadar, Yitale, Yitalal, Shemed, Kudsha, Barichu, La'ela min kol birchata v'shirata, Tushbechata v'nechemata, Da'amiran be'alma v'imru, Amen. Yehe shlama rabba min shemaya, V'chayim alenu ve'al kol Yisrael v'imru, Amen. Oseh shalom b'imromav, Uya aseh shalom, alenu ve'al kol Yisrael v'imru, Amen.
Oseh shalom bimromav, hu ya'aseh shalom aleinu, ve'al kol Yisrael, ve'imru, imru, amen.
Amen. And this morning, Barbara, we're going to close.
I'm going to end with Shir Chadash, sing a new song. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, borei peri hagafen. L'chaim.
Chaim, amen.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam hamotzi lechem min haaretz. Amen. B'teavon and Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom, everyone. Good to be with you this morning to pray and to sing and to remember. And as a reminder, as those Talmudic rabbis reminded us, there is, of course, real depth in prayer and praise, but there is also depth and meaning in our silence. So I want to wish you a restful day, a reflective week ahead, and a Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom, everyone.
Shabbat Shalom.